Hi guys. This is a video on the planet Saturn. I'm going to try to do an overview of the planet and what it means on a more essential level so that you can get a better idea of how to utilize it in astrological interpretation and to understand its effects in your own life more completely and holistically. This is part of my planet series. One video for each planet with a couple introduction videos, and maybe more to come after that. So let's get right to it. Saturn, the principle of focus, binding, and contraction. Could also think of it as constriction as well. This is just my basic description of the planets on my website. And so in a moment, we're going to move to a more complete understanding of Saturn as well. But if we think about this, the Saturn's usually thought of as, the great malefic, the bringer of sorrow, that you're doomed when Saturn comes around. People, astrologers and amateur astrologers alike, really have a fear of Saturn. It's kind of, it's gotten a bad rap over the years. And of course, there's been many great books written about it that sort of aim to dispel that bad rap. And so this is just like one more attempt in that direction, perhaps. And what I'm trying to explain is that there's no benefic, malefic is a arbitrary distinction that we make as astrologers to understand things just quickly and easily. But oftentimes, benefic, malefic, this notion of good and bad, can really interfere with our ability to do astrology holistically and to understand the energetic principles we're working with and why things are happening the way they are. So Saturn is just the principle of focus, right? And that's why that's why it is also the first planet in the series of the seven bodies as described in the ancient sort of arrangement of the seven spheres, which I talked about in a previous video. Saturn is basically the phase of creation. And we have to remember these phases of creation are also non-linear. They're not, even though we describe them as happening in these graded steps, they're also all happening simultaneously. And it's not necessarily like one happens and then the other. So just keep that in mind. But if you have a diffuse, void of energy, so to speak, or you just have, it's just pure energy and whatnot. And if we think of the Big Bang concept, right, like you have all this energy sort of condensing and coming together, it's focusing. And by focusing, it can become something more than just a sort of raw series of potential. It's kind of like, the ocean would be a fairly good example. The ocean is just like this diffuse sea of sort of chaos in a sense. Like there's not much order to it. But let's say a whirlpool forms in it or something like that, then it starts to become focused and the energy starts to be capable of creating something definite, so to speak. Maybe not the best example, but you're sort of getting the idea perhaps. And then when it focuses, right, so that's really the in-breath. Saturn's really the in-breath. And then Jupiter will be the expansion, the out-breath, right, where everything in the Big Bang cosmology of modern science, right, it explodes, so to speak, and then the universe is filled with different components and whatnot. I'm not an expert on the Big Bang, but that's the basic idea of it. So, and that's why, as I'll talk about in the next video, Jupiter is more the principle of power, which includes expansion and equilibrium, but isn't necessarily fundamentally about expansion. It's really the raw release of power. Whereas Saturn is that binding, contraction, and constriction, constricture, right? Con is Latin for with, and then stricture, structure, right, is another Latin word, basically. So with structure. So Saturn creates the foundations upon which everything else will be built. And I have this nifty little picture I found. It's just the foundations of a temple. And this is often what I like to think of when I think of Saturn. I just like to think of the raw foundations of a building, or it could be the building constructed, but it's there's nothing more going on in it necessarily yet, right? It's just the pure building and the structure, and there's no activity in it. There's no life. There's no decorations. There's no people doing rituals or anything. It's just the pureness of the structure, the structural integrity. And so if we think of the human skeleton, we also get a picture of that, right? The skeleton is sort of the physical basis upon which everything else will be constructed. And so therefore Saturn is kind of like a blueprint. And if we look at an actual picture of blueprints in just a moment here, if I can access it, because Zoom is getting in my way, we find that we have something like this. And so Saturn is always emphasizing this essential blueprint that everything else is built off of for us, right? So Saturn really, in its action as a principle of the cosmos, we could say, is really always emphasizing our essential structure, and thereby it has something in relationship to the sun, which is more like our essential nature or our core pattern, core self, right? If Saturn is like the spine and the bones and the skull, the sun would be like the cerebrospinal fluid that fills it, and the sun would be the animation of the bones, the brain, and even the bone marrow as well, right? So they're actually very closely related, which brings us back to this idea that opposites at their extreme are really just one and the same energy. So you have Saturn, the most dark principle, and Sun, the most bright principle, and they're really actually emphasizing the same thing in different ways. Sun is emphasizing our core self, our core connection to the divine, while Saturn's emphasizing the structural components that sort of give that core self a capacity to manifest or exist or have a vehicle to work through. So Saturn really isn't about limitation in a negative sense. It's not really fundamentally negative at all. And in our modern day culture, and even for the past several thousand years, I think Saturn's gotten a bad rap because people are generally afraid to sort of, get back to what they really are. We tend to stray from our core essential structure and that sort of a thing. And then basically what happens is we suffer as a result because we're resisting the structural integrity of our temple, which is our body. The body is described as a temple in certain sacred texts. So if we are getting away from the structural integrity of our temple, we are going to have problems, right? If we're trying to put in like plumbing in some part of the temple that doesn't make sense for it to be there, we're going to have, emotional problems, leakage, right? And a problem with the water flowing. Maybe we put the altar in the wrong place and we are doing the sacrifices in the totally wrong spot of the temple. Or worse, we've blocked the doorway to the temple with a bunch of stuff that doesn't belong there. And so that's why Saturn can be so frustrating for people, because it's about getting back to that core integrity, which is also related to the sun again. So here I've written a bit about Saturn, and you can check this page out and read what I've written and whatnot. And I'm not going to read everything, but I do want to turn your attention to kind of the Sufic doctrine that I've quoted extensively for these planets. And basically, this is saying that Saturn is the intellect reason. Al-Akhal is what it's called in Arabic here. And so I like what the author of this book, Titus Burckhardt, has written. And so I'll just read it. Saturn, the most distant of the planets that are visible to the naked eye, corresponds to intellect reason. Just as the heaven of Saturn includes all the other planetary heavens, intellect reason embraces all things. Moreover, the abstract, cold, and Saturnian character of reason is opposite to the solar and central nature of the heart, which marks intellect in its total and existential aspect, meaning that the sun is a symbol of the all-embracing cosmic intellect, whereas Saturn is a symbol of the intellect in terms of in a more limited capacity, so to speak, in a more individualized capacity. And then he goes on, here it must be made quite plain that the term intellect, al-akhal, is in practice applied at more than one level. It may designate the universal principle of all intelligence, which is the sun, a principle which transcends the limiting conditions of the mind. But the direct reflection of universal intellect in thought may also be called intellect. And in this case, it corresponds to what the ancients called reason. So Saturn functions as reason in the human psyche, right, which is aloof and removed, totally objective, dispassionate, cold, unconnected to anything. It's just looking at things as they purely are. And so that's another clue about Saturn in our charts and in our life. When we need to fulfill responsibilities, when we need to be disciplined, discipline meaning coming from the word disciple and therefore having inner learning, we need to be impersonal. We need to remove ourselves and our opinions and our feelings from the situation so that we can assess properly what we need to do and what needs to happen and what is, maybe in reverse order of what I just said, and that way we can interface with reality instead of what we often think reality is. So Saturn is cold, aloof, and impersonal, deeply impersonal, which is another reason he's the most impersonal of the planets, because he moves the slowest and he's the furthest away with regard to what we can see with the planets we can see with the naked eye. So he is not concerned with what we think or how we feel about something. In a sense, as a character, he is the one coming in and going, hate to be the bearer of bad news, but if you want to do what you are saying you want to do, you need to realize that first you need to do all of these things to make sure that you are building a strong foundation that will support whatever it is you're doing in the future, and that foundation or the things you do in the future are in accordance with your foundation and your structural integrity, your bones, right? So it's really that simple with Saturn, and I encourage you to come here and read what I've written about him as well, a few of my own sort of comments on Saturn and whatnot. And, you know, I put at the end here too, I'll read it real quick and then the video will be over, that when Saturn often says no, it is only because such experiences, people, or things are dissonant relative to our structural core. So there's no reason to be afraid of Saturn ever in any system of astrology if you understand how it works. It's not the bearer of bad news in the way we imagine. It's not crushing us and crushing our spirit and making us ignorant, as is often said in some older texts. It is merely trying to re-emphasize our structural core, our structural integrity, and that's all. So peace be upon you who have watched this video, and meditate some more on Saturn, the Lord of Focus. And don't forget to hit like, subscribe. Please share this video, and please check out my website for individualized readings and other information. Thanks so much.